You click it, it'll go red.
Okay, we are now live, so we will educate one another as we're proceeding through this. Welcome to the Conflict Consortium virtual workshop with myself, Christian Davenport, and Erica Chenoweth as hosts. Today's paper is from Sophia Hatz, Demolition, Threat, and Political Preferences in the West Bank, Insights into Repression and Dissent. In the kind of standard Charles Tillian model, we will start with discussing this today, Carly Wayne from University of Michigan. The presenter will then get some comments, and then we open the floor to everyone's comments and roll from there to see where we go. If you have a substantive kind of like longer contribution to make, that would be a one finger, you do that, and then I'll take the cue and write you down. If you're kind of directly on point, then you give the two finger. I will also do that. If I do not see your fingers, then type in the group chat, and that's another way to kind of get things commented. And I quite frequently use it for, if a citation comes up or something really small, I'll just kind of like put a note over there for the presenter so they can kind of like see that later on, or a snarky remark to someone else that's on the panel. Carly, why don't you get us started, and then we'll go from there.
Sure. So first of all, Sophia, thank you for sending us this paper. I found it very interesting. And actually, I found it very polished. I know you wrote a couple of times that this was a very early draft, and it seemed pretty polished to me for such an early draft. So I thought it was impressive work. I'll restrict my comments to kind of three major areas. The first and most important will be the as if random assumption, since your paper kind of hinges on that assumption. And then next, I'll talk a bit about your characterization of administrative demolition as selective or not, and question some of your preliminary results and the measures that you're using for them. So first, relating to the as if random assumption. So you basically have two assumptions. One, that the demolition orders are as if random, and the fact that they're unrelated to Palestinian political attitudes. And the second assumption is that orders and attitudes are not systematically related to something else that's causing both of these things to happen or to vary. So for the first assumption, I think you're on firmer ground there, that the administrative demolition orders are not systematically related to Palestinian political attitudes. But I'll push you on a few things there. First, so your random forest analysis indicates that some demographic variables are the kind of most predictive variables for administrative demolition orders. And those demographic orders tend to be really highly correlated with militancy. So things like refugee status, young age, male, and unemployed were really at the top of your list. And so I'm wondering if those are in some ways proxying militancy. You do control for those variables in your analysis, but it's still not getting at the militancy variable. You can't control for that. And then second, I was wondering if Israel could use administrative detentions as a way of essentially avoiding public condemnation for demolitions. And so they're saying they are using them for some political purpose to target groups that they don't like or groups with attitudes they don't like, but they're saying it's this kind of administrative as opposed to a punitive demolition, and so they're using it as cover, in which case it would be related to political attitudes. One way of getting that would just be kind of like qualitative interviews with Israeli security officials. And so I had made a note about that at the beginning of your paper, and then I saw at the end that was maybe an avenue you were going to explore in future research. And so I think I would support that. I think that's a good way of getting at that. So I'm wondering if Palestinians are building in these places in order to be provocative. For example, Jewish settlers do that all the time. Like the reason Jewish settlers in the West Bank build illegal structures is because of their political attitudes, and they want to be provocative, and they want to claim a hill or something like that for Jewish settlers. So I'm wondering if Palestinian settlers or Palestinian civilians are doing that same thing, that they're saying, oh, Israel doesn't want us to build here, but I'm going to build here anyways on purpose to demonstrate that we have the right to do this. And finally, your main kind of control for militancy is district level Israeli casualties. I think that's the best way to kind of proxy militants district, because Palestinians can travel. I mean, it's difficult. They have to go through checkpoints and things like that, but it's not necessarily that Palestinians harm or kill Israelis within their district. Often they get entry passes into Israel itself, for example, and commit crimes in Israel. Less recently, but in your time period that you're analyzing, that was very common. So that's about the as of random assumption. Secondly, this idea of both being correlated to some other external factor. I think that settlement and settlers is going to be your biggest problem there, because demolition orders are probably systematically related to numbers of settlers in the area, and numbers of settlers in the area are probably systematically related to Palestinian political attitudes. And so you mentioned in your paper that settlements were roughly constant through the period, what just demonstrates that that's not the right measure of that variable to use, because even though settlements are relatively constant, there's only been like 8 additional ones since the 70s. The numbers have like quadrupled. I have a link to like a Haaretz expose that I could send you that really goes through all these numbers. So for example, from like 1986 to 1997, the settler numbers tripled in the West Bank, even though there was only 6 additional settlements that were made. And so I think you might want to use numbers instead of numbers of settlers instead of numbers of settlement as a variable there. You also mentioned that, just kind of an aside in your paper, that demolition orders peaked during the Second Intifada and during the period from 2008 to 2010. So both of those times were periods of high Palestinian militancy. The second time was the Gaza War, Operation Cast Lead, was in 2009. And so it's very possible that those actions are what's driving the militant attitudes and not the orders themselves. And in fact, Israel will often undertake action in the West Bank during wars in Gaza because they have kind of cover to do so. Everyone's focusing on Gaza and they'll do things in the West Bank. And so that could be driving some of your results. And then finally, I was just wondering if this was like a Hebron effect. This is where almost all of the orders were. It was a much higher peak. And this is also an area of huge contention. There's an Israeli settlement in Hebron. Parts of it are Area A and parts of it are Area C. So that might be driving part of the effect there. Okay, that's all I have on that main point. And then just 2 other minor points before I turn it over to you in the group. You talk about how administrative demolition is by definition not selective, and I would just, I guess, push back a little bit on that. It seems like it by definition is selective. They're picking specific places to demolish and not others, or to order demolitions and not others. And that just has implications in terms of also the legality and things like that. So I think you need to like push stronger about why this is random if you want to make the point that it's clearly illegal and things like that, which it very well might be. And then just some of your initial results from your regression models. There's a couple of things that surprised me, and it might point to measurement issues. First, the actual demolition coefficient is not significant, so you think that that would even have more of an effect than the orders. Second, the home demolition orders seem to increase militancy more than Palestinian fatalities in that district. So again, you think Palestinian fatalities would have a bigger effect than demolition orders. And also the Israeli settlement coefficient is significant and negative, which seems like the exact opposite of what you would expect. And so that just, again, tells me that maybe that's not the right measure of settlement activity for you to use. I have a couple of smaller points, but I think I'll just leave it for the rest of the discussion. So again, thank you.
Sophia. Unmute.
Great. Okay, now? Yes. Thanks, Carly. That was great. At first, just wanted to say thanks for giving me the opportunity to be here. But also, it's really great to have that kind of specific feedback from someone that clearly knows the context. So that was enormously helpful. Should I respond to the specific issues first, or do you want more background on where the context of the paper?
We're less background than addressing the kind of comments so that we can try to kind of like help you move things forward. We'll just allow people to kind of like read the paper and go learn about the conflict on their own effectively. But but you don't need to address everything right now. So you could just address a couple, the ones that are most prominent in your head, and then we can kind of like open it up, and I'm sure that you'll get to the rest. Yeah.
So I think that Carly identified kind of the big things that are on my plate right now. And this is definitely an early draft. For me, I know I have a lot ahead, a lot of work to do on this. And kind of the main things that I want to work on are, one, clarifying for myself, like this assumption of as if random. And I think that in the current stage, it's being a bit imprecise about what that is and how to kind of assess that. And so that's something that I need to work on. And so Carly identified two kind of assumptions that I would say that have kind of mixed support right now. I think that, Carly, I think that you're right that administrative demolition orders could be used in some cases as a pretext, or the reason, building violations, that statement is sometimes a pretext when maybe the underlying motivation may be more punitive. It's hard to assess, it's hard to measure how much, the extent to which that's occurring, but that does pose some problems. Then I think another major challenge to the as if random assumption is that Palestinians don't build as if randomly. So you're right that they do. I don't know how to assess this. Again, I don't know how to measure it, but I think that there is, to some extent, Palestinians are choosing to build probably in areas where there's less of a demolition risk. Or the opposite, or they're choosing to build near settlements to be provocative. I'm not sure. It's hard to assess that. So those, I need to clarify the assumptions that I'm making and also how to assess those, and that's something that I have to work on. And then the next big sort of task for me is specifying the model correctly. And like you said, there are a lot of, I think that the measures that I'm using right now are probably not the best. In terms of Palestinian fatalities, I only have the district where the Israeli fatality occurred, and I don't have the district of residence of the Palestinian attacker, although I think that that would be the ideal, that would be a better measure. I just haven't been able to get that data, although I've seen other people use it, so I know it's out there. But that would be preferable. And then for the settlements, I do have the settler population and the number of settlements, and then I have the number of settlement outposts established per year. And I think this is the data from B'Tselem. I think that there is possibly better data out there, although for this time period I haven't been able to get it. But that's, I agree that there are some weird directions and effects right now. I think that part of that might also be just that the model specification is not good. So I think probably my next step will be to try a multi-level model and see, also to address the issue of like, is this all Hebron, driven by Hebron? And just that there's obviously a lot of variation across districts. So there's, the results may change a lot depending on what steps I take there.
As you wound down, kind of.
Yeah, I can say one more thing. I will be going to Israel to do some field work in February and March. And so I hope to be able to get in contact with some Israeli officials to ask a bit about the process of how demolition orders are issued. Although so far no one has responded to my requests. Understandably.
Erica, you're the one, and now we're open.
Yeah, so I actually wanted to follow up a little bit on this question about the different, the relevance of the spatial correlation between attacks and demolition orders, just because, especially over the time series that you're evaluating here, the nature of attacks coming, especially from Gaza, and the Israeli kind of counter response changed quite a lot. So during the Second Intifada, you have a full-scale occupation of Gaza, for example, but in the Operation Cast Lead and in the 2014 war was less about full-scale occupation and more about artillery shelling. And in fact, the Israeli fatalities were quite low during that time relative to during the Second Intifada or the mid 90s, because it wasn't suicide bombings, it was rocket attacks, which there were many of them, but they aren't very lethal, right? So I wonder if Israeli fatalities is really the right proxy, because it very much like the problem with the demolition order versus the actual demolition. Rocket attacks may not kill a lot of Israelis, but they surely threaten a lot of Israelis, and the demand for an immediate security response is very high because the level of insecurity it produces, even if it's not killing a lot of people. So I wonder if there are other ways to account for the sort of threat environment, as you might call it, other than the actual number of deaths. Particularly the number of deaths proximate to the different districts that you're looking at. And I can't recall off the top of my head any good data on the number of rocket attacks. I have seen like data on that, but I'm not sure how robust they are and whether they were collected over, a considerable time series. But I can look into that and send you some information if you don't know immediate sources.
I have it too, and I know Carly does on the data one, but Sophia, do you want to start with a response to Erica?
No, I agree. Rocket attack data would be really good, and I don't know for this time period on the district or sub-district level if I can get that.
Okay, Carly, tell them.
You have it?
Yeah, not to plug my own work or anything, but I'm currently working on building a data set of Palestinian attacks against Israel from 2008 through today. So it's not as long of a time series as you're working with, but I have detailed data on like numbers of rockets and things like that daily since 2008, in addition to other kinds of attacks. Another data source you might look at that I'm using for part of this paper that I'm working on is a paper by Haushofer, Haushofer. He has data on rockets from 2000 through 2008. During that period, rockets were not like the predominant form of attack, at least up until 2005. But he has that data, and that's the replication materials for that are public. So I can share with you the data, but it's not actually published yet. I'm working on the paper.
So my data too, and then I want to get back to something else Erica was talking about. My data too is I could have sworn that Zaitsev and Gutmansky have some piece on rockets fired, I think in both directions actually, that I think might be useful. My other comment relating back to part of where Erica was going is part of my difficulty with you narrowing the focus to demolitions is because you kind of slide back into the rest of the repressive repertoire, right? But we don't have some sense of the sheer largesse of different tactics that could be employed. And so demolition as one strategy to achieve one particular objective isn't put into the broader context of what these other tactics are trying to do. And some of these other tactics, so this for me was the omitted variable issue, right? I'm just like, well, what are these other forms of repression trying to do that either compels or eliminates the necessity for demolition? And so in a sense, you have different logics for different repressive tactics, right? And demolition might be one to physically remove some individuals in a kind of displacement-like sense. But targeted assassination is to try to achieve something else. A ban or a curfew is to try to achieve something else. And so I'm imagining that demolitions might serve some unique kind of thing, but that there is some overlap with some other tactics, but you don't give us any of that. And so I'm wondering how you address or could address kind of repertoire. So rockets might give you something, right? But it's like, also the Israelis and the Palestinians are doing stuff to one another. So that dynamic interaction, I don't know that attitudinally your sense of whether or not you saw kind of efficacy and trust in government is. I also want behavior, and deaths might give you something, but you might petitions, protests. I think there's enough robust data on kind of different forms of Palestinian resistance and protest and so forth that you could include into the model that might be related to the demolition effort. Because I was kind of like, what is demolition supposed to achieve, right? So it's facilitating this broader issue, but then it also is kind of like physically trying to. So in a sense, I thought that the demolition tactic was more long-term, right? Because you're trying to depopulate an area, and you're almost treating it like an event. And so that's why I was wondering about the spatial and temporal lags as well. But I'm like, because I could imagine the expansion is not. I don't think that it's random, right? Because it's developmentally. It's like, okay, you're blocked here by a road, or you're blocked here by some mountains, and so I think growth is probably in some logical, coherent pattern. But that was just my suggestion. Laura has it too.
Yes, hi. Christian, I had this same kind of reaction as you did.
Oh, Laura, my apologies. Everyone was supposed to introduce themselves when they first speak. so my apologies.
University of Maryland. Glad to be here. Interesting read. So I had a similar reaction as Christian, although as I was beginning to read the paper, I was pretty convinced you were going to be using the demolition orders as an instrument, not necessarily as its own variable, because it does have some nice features as an instrument to try to get at repression that's not necessarily triggered by other types of efforts to repress. And so I'm wondering if you've thought about that at all, and if you know what I mean by the instrument. But also related to that, the thing that I think bothers me the most of it, I mean, I think it's clever, but not quite there. But the yearly lag. You say in your arguments that getting these orders are random, and that they're upsetting and they bring on their own stress. But then you measure it a year later, or you look for an effect a year later, and it may be that there's an immediate stress, but then there's this period of waiting, and while they're waiting, they don't know whether or not the order will actually be executed. In fact, so few are. So I'm wondering if there's any way you can actually get at the timing of this so that it could get closer to what you're trying to measure. Related to that, because you're using all these other repressive measures as controls, why not measure them during the actual current year? Even though you're going to have some issues with temporal ordering, they're just control variables. And so you could take care of the actual demolitions during the current year that might be, you might be better able to isolate the order effect. So those are just a couple suggestions that I thought of. I haven't thought them all the way through, but that would be your job.
Sophie, you want to respond or keep moving?
Just quickly, I think that's a great idea that I didn't think of to measure them in the current year. In terms of the year lag, fortunately have more fine-grained data than I just have the year level, which is a pretty bad limitation, but I can't get around it.
Sammy, you're up. Unmute and the queue is open. Still muted. I think you need to unmute in the system of the Google Hangout. Go to the top, scroll to the top.
Are you hearing me now?
There you go.
Okay. I'm Sami Miari from Tel Aviv University, and now I'm at Oxford University. I didn't understand one question, Erica's question about the instrument. To using the house demolition as an instrument for what? Before I'm,
I think that was Laura.
I think that's for Laura.
I'm starting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. I want to. I will start about the general idea. This is really very important research. I think this research adds to the literature on the effect of state policy and on violence in general, and to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict literature in specific. The idea of the research, I think, is brilliant, which has never been researched before in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, using administrative data on house demolition. Although the research shows substantial variation across Palestinian districts in the house demolition, I think still there is need for more discussion on the elements which ensure a clean identification of the house demolition and political preferences. There are two potential sources of endogeneity, and I think Sophia already tried to discuss this in the paper. The first concern the relation between specific house demolition and political preferences. For example, certain location of district may matter for both house demolition and the political preferences. I give you an example, and you already used this in order to relieve the omitted variable issue in your estimation strategy. The district close to Israeli settlement, for example, may have a relatively high share of employment in the settlement, and thus more moderate attitude against Israeli. At the same time, they also may experience more or less violence, as the settlement are also associated with increased presence of the Israeli army. And of course, at the end, this will cause a kind of clashes between Palestinian and the Israeli army, and will make more Palestinian more radical, with more radical position. On the other hand, settlement increased the tension over the scarce natural resources, and such as land and water, and at the end, more Palestinian construction without permits. So we, in order to relieve this kind of, endogeneity, I think using a proxy for the settlement is a great idea, but I think you need to modify this in a way that you also weight your variables with the distance of the settlement from the main city of the district. For example, you take the closest settlement, to the district of Ramallah, then you can take the main city of Ramallah, of the district is Ramallah, and you just calculate this as a distance, and you weight your variable in the settler population with this distance, because the farthest distance the settlement from the district, the less effect of the settlement on the political preferences. Additionally, I think another variable that you also, I think, could use, will be the distance to the green line. The green line, which is identify the international recognized border between Israel and the Palestinian territories. The distance to the green line may affect both house demolition, because locality closer to Israel may be more easily reachable by the Israeli army and by the Israeli authorities. And this is also will be related to the political preferences, because locality closer to Israel are more likely to have people employed in Israel, and this will make the Palestinian with more moderate attitudes. I think you maybe you will try also to relieve your omitted variables bias in your estimation strategy by using this, by including this control in your question. Another point here that
hold on,
Palestinian-
Sammy. Let's let her get on that one first. That was huge. Let her respond to that one first.
Here. I have still.
I know this. We have an hour. We're good.
Those are a lot of really good there. I mean, I think if I can get the geographic data, that would really help a lot. I guess the distance to settlements I can do. I didn't think of that, but I think that's a clear, yeah, that's something I can do. That's a great idea. The distance to the green line would be great. Also, the distance to the barrier for the years that's relevant would be great. I don't have that data yet, but if I can get it, then I will do that. And I think also with your comments,
yeah.
Sorry, as you're talking about,
Yeah,
as you're talking about the settlements, and this is also related a bit to comments from Carly and Laura, that I'm thinking that I have to think a bit more about what I'm actually measuring and trying to measure with the settlements proxy, because a lot of different things packed into a lot of different kinds of measures. So that's something I need to do a lot more thinking about, I think, especially since it's clearly an important factor.
Please read my paper on the effect of the Israeli settlement on the, yeah, please. You will start from there, and if you will need more data on the settlements, I will help you.
Great.
Carly, did you have it too? Okay.
Yeah, I think one other measure you might want to think about is, I don't know if you can get it, but just like the settlement growth, just in terms of size. Because one of the biggest problems for Palestinians is they see like, oh, we're doing peace negotiations on the one hand, but in my backyard, the settlement just keeps getting closer and closer to my house. Like they just expand. So even if it's just one settlement, the size of it has increased over time. I think that might help.
Yeah, my quick two on the settlement issue was, so I was reading some paper and they were talking about settlements are multiple things simultaneously, right? So it is a way to extend power. It's also a way to legitimate subsequent kind of military intervention. It serves as a kind of paramilitary hub that then can expand. It's much more dynamic in many respects than how you were looking. Sammy, I added you to the list to the one. My one was in line with my initial comment about repertoires. I was kind of like, it's the intent of demolitions, right? I'm just like, the way you set it up is kind of like in the repression dissent kind of framework in many respects, and then you kind of deviate from it because demolitions are kind of a non-traditional form of repression, and then the dissent that you pay attention to is different than folks that pay attention to. So I'm like, I don't think demolitions were intended to prevent short-term dissent, right? And so it's to eliminate kind of Palestinian hold or positions in land, and so I think that orientation is different. There was an alternative explanation, actually, though, that I was thinking about with regards to the intent of different repressive strategies, and that was to disrupt Palestinian organization, right? So there's really no organization in your argument, but if that's the kind of like target, so Perlman's argument talks about, it's all about kind of social movement organizations and how well they're doing and how you're perturbing them. You could argue that demolitions are a way of disrupting a social political network, which has implications for organizations. But there is some organizational data that I think you could find that that maps the locations, and then it might be that these demolitions are a kind of pretext for disrupting in a way that kind of like has that kind of take, because you might have organizations and not have behavior, and for a purpose, right? The organizations could be a hub of potential activity, and then they figure out where to go behaviorally. And so the behavior might be one place, people where they're living might be someplace else, where they're meeting is someplace else. And so I kept trying to think about, I kept looking at the map and I'm just like, oh, okay, where are people based? And if you're based in a location, are you likely to behave there or take your actions someplace else where the state is more vulnerable? And so I was trying to make it much more dynamic and try to overlay organizations to your basic kind of like thesis. Response to that? or no, we're good.
Just, I think the point that you're making about how does this fit into kind of repertoire of repression or coercive or occupation tactics, I think that's a really important point that I'll have to think about more, because I think that the orders, it's a different, I think actually like the orders themselves are kind of a different tactic from the demolitions. But that's kind of unsubstantiated. That's sort of just my opinion. That's what I see, in that that the orders are just a way of kind of, they're a way of just making Palestinians kind of afraid or feel insecure in where they are.
I mean, my quick two on that was how you frame the demolitions, right? Because you come close to arguing that it is a mechanism of state terror. I mean, if we just take some of the words you just used, it's to induce fear within the population. It's to terrorize. Now, whether or not it's actually followed through, you might not need to, right? It might be a function of how vulnerable or scared people are in a location. And I don't know if the survey stuff that you have over time kind of gets some sense of latent fear, but that seems like that's kind of directly relevant to it, because if a particular geographic population isn't as fearful as they could be otherwise, then you might be more likely to kind of threaten in that particular location. But if organizationally they have some capacity to counter you, then you might not want to follow through. So then this interaction between kind of what people are thinking and what they organizationally can do and what behaviorally they have done might come together. So this was more of my kind of contentious politics, social movement kind of orientation, thinking about how these things were related, and you kind of were separating them or unpacking them in some way. Eric on the two.
Yeah, just a quick two-finger on that in terms of the way that the dependent variable is really kind of constructed is these support, preferences for different organizations or parties. And I wonder if, in line with Christian's point, whether, the intent of the demolitions isn't to necessarily demobilize just violent, types of interaction by Palestinian militant groups. It's actually trying to demobilize any type of dissent or resistance. And so, I wonder if there's a possibility, like Christian had mentioned earlier, there's a lot of data on protest and sort of nonviolent and violent forms of contentious mobilization beyond just direct attacks on Israelis that I think could be really helpful, even if it isn't the main story of this article. It could be something that's useful to explore. And then you could also, turn it into a new article or a longer piece about, the effects of this type of activity on just contentious mobilization more generally, which to me speaks to the larger kind of political conflict. It seems like really it's any dissent at all that is costly for the Israeli government, not just Palestinian militant attacks on Israelis.
Sophia, I'm going to go to Sammy unless you're saying something.
I just want to say that I think the dependent variable is the weakest point right now, and it's like really limiting the entire analysis pretty much in terms of time span, not to say the least. I mean, I have the demolition order data from '88 to 2014. So an alternative dependent variable would be great.
Yeah, I have a suggestion. Okay, so this is a great idea. I will continue from also this idea of having another really dependent variable to measure the effect of the house demolition. But first, I want to continue with my talk about your methodology. I think I have a problem also in your variable in the Palestinian population. I suggest to replace it by population density, because population density will measure also, how how people are not able, to construct within the same community, and I think this will be better to use it and not to use only the Palestinian population as a control. The other potential source of endogeneity, I think, will be the reverse causality, and you discussed this in your paper. But still, I cannot see any evidence from the research about there is no reverse causality. It's easy. It's easy to do it, and please do it. You can just show that there is no reverse causality. You will calculate, for example, the political preferences at the district level in different periods, and you can see how this link to the house demolition at the district level in different periods. So if there is no relation, then you can say there is no reverse causality. Yeah. So I also would suggest for you to use the locality share of vote for factions that hold moderate position on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict from the two Palestinian elections, the 1997 and 2006. So this will help you to avoid subjectivity of the interviews. Data exist from the Palestinian Central Election Committee at the district level, and it's easy. And if you have a problem with that, I will help you to get the data.
Sophia, you good? Carly.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk a little bit about the dependent variable issue. So I agree with Erica that you might want data on like other kinds of activity, particularly since the Intifada, the primary kind of form of mobilization in the West Bank is protest, or as Israelis often say, riot, protests that turn into riots, depending on your perspective. So it's not actually a lot of like violence as you think of it, like with suicide bombings and things like that. So I'm collecting data on that, but it's only since 2008, so it doesn't really help you all the way back to 1988, but that might give you some leverage. Because that, in some ways, for Israel, kind of nonviolent protest is more damaging than violent protest, because to a certain extent, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is being fought in the court of public opinion, international court of public opinion these days, and violent attacks from Palestinians in some ways serve Israel's narrative. Nonviolent action doesn't. So that might even be more dangerous to them in some ways. That's it.
I think that's a great suggestion.
Laura had it too.
So to follow up on that, I'm still kind of stuck on this idea of these orders and how they're administered. It seems as if these are, somebody builds in the area and then they're issued an order, but these orders are they pasted to the building or a house? And the reason I ask that is because if you think about public protest, that's kind of a bringing together of a bunch of people to fight against something, as opposed to which might be more responsive to physical demolitions rather than bureaucratic pieces of mail that come through. And so the connectivity, I actually think that the public opinion might be more relevant because when you get something in the mail, you get pissed or angered. Sorry. You see what I'm saying? You want to think about the connection between the two. I mean, the time lag is a bigger issue, and you may want to think about even measuring the demolition orders in the same year, just to look at the difference between, because you don't really have a reverse causality with the demolition order, the demolition orders and the survey attitudes. So much that by looking at both the current and the lag, you might get some information on that. Just a thought.
Sophia? Yeah,
just to answer your question about how the orders are served, because that's actually an important point. So they're not mailed, but they are supposed to be kind of taped to the door or whatever. If it's a tent, there is supposed to be a piece of paper that is delivered with the demolition order notice. Of course, it's hard to know whether that occurs 100% of the time. Some people say that these orders are delivered at night, or they're taped to the outside of a tent on a windy day, and so it's not clear whether 100% of those orders are received. But my general impression, and this is all just qualitative, is that they know when they have a demolition order, that the information gets to them somehow. I thought about the instrument design at first, and I don't know a lot about instrumental variable analysis, but I wasn't sure whether it would work since Palestinians can appeal these orders. And then if there's an appeal, then it goes to court, and then there's a whole nother process. So it's not a clean assignment from order to order being executed. There's processes that intervene, and those processes themselves might be kind of random. Or they could not be random, or it could be correlated with election years. I don't know. That was a tangled web that I didn't know if it was clean enough to do an IV estimation.
Laura had a follow-up too.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for the clarification. So I'm still kind of stuck on it, but I think it's important to understand this. So when these orders are issued, is it that they go around to a bunch of structures and tape them on the doors in waves? So is there a wave in which a bunch of structures get these things taped to them, and then everybody will notice them, and presumably they'll just rip them down once they get them, right? They're not going to leave them on the doors for a long time, but they know they've been flagged, and they hope that nothing comes of it. And I think that in and of itself is an event. I mean, I know you don't have the refined data to know, how many structures are taped on which days, but I think that in and of itself, after there's a wave of tapings, could be more of what you're getting at when you discuss this unprovoked repression. That you're trying to get at unprovoked repression, and I think, regardless of what the outcome is, the issuing of these orders are what the feature of an instrument is that there's these waves of unprovoked repression, while there's actual repression that may be reacting to other things. And so I mean, I'd be happy to talk with you offline about strategies of what you're trying to isolate, and how a good instrument is related to the key concept that you're trying to do, but not related to the other stuff, not related to the provoked repression, but it's related to the unprovoked repression. And so, I'll be happy to talk to you about it later and brainstorm.
Carly, you're one, right? Okay. My quick two was concerning. It's kind of related. Laura just made me think of the framing. So part of this is framed as a kind of repression and dissent explanation, but then you have the single tactic out of the repertoire, and then you have the selective and indiscriminate kind of riff going on a lot. That's a lot, right? So it's like you are weaving together. The repression literature is quite frequently a mess, and I grant that. And I'm just I would like those to be kind of like tied together a little bit more coherently. Like, is our primary takeaway about the selective and indiscriminate debate? Is it about trying to assess a single tactic from a repertoire, or is it kind of like how does dissent affect repression? How does repression affect dissent? I mean, it's just like I thought that there was a bit too much going on. And then Laura introduces another element with kind of another qualified aspect of repression. And so I think this is interesting, because the minute I start to try to figure out which take you're trying to get, for me, my contextualization kind of thing kicks in, and I'm kind of like, okay, so if there's some monolithic plan to all of this, right? So then someone's allowing settlers to go out. There's another agency that's basically saying we should demolish something, and then somebody else that kicks in to be like, okay, we're actually going to demolish something. And then there's some drones over here. There's some military incursions over there. I'm not saying that's not the case, but I'm like, that's underlying and that's hidden kind of like within your paper. And it would be nice to kind of like pull these things together, because then you're developing an argument of like, okay, so when is demolition interesting? So I notice you don't have any pieces in it. You don't kind of reference the literature on the effect of violence on internal displacement and refugees. But that would be directly relevant to this. Again, I'm now asking you to pare down and then identify something else that was there, right? But this is all about providing you with options. And then the spatial component, right? So a lot of your stuff is kind of like specific to a particular geographic location, but I'm like, well, what if some stuff is taking place near something of religious significance, which is not identified, right? So that might have implications for whether or not you're using demolitions, or you're going to be a little more aggressive, or it's settler-led as opposed to settler-followed. So there's different ways that I'm interested in the sequences, right? Because I'm kind of going, oh, okay, do we have a demolition, then a settler thing comes in? But no, you could, part of your riff is that you could have a settler group nearby, and that leads to demolition. So these might be different sequences, and those sequences might have implications for how the population feels about it or what's going on. And so a different modeling strategy is, and I don't know that anyone does this really anymore, which is just kind of like literally laying out what the sequence is, and if those sequences are comparable or different across different contexts. But this is more like a DNA string, as opposed to trying to tease out the specific kind of causal influence going one particular direction, or even the reciprocal dynamic. I'm just curious about, wow, if we had to think of these things sequentially, how does that sequence map over time? Because the whole Hebron effect might represent a particular sequence, and the different geographic locations might, and that was just more of a riff of a two before we get to Erica.
Yeah, on that note, really quickly, just a two on that. Laura has done some work on tactical regimes in the UK, and she and I have done some stuff on tactical regimes in Israel. And then I think Renan Cooperman has had some stuff on tactical regimes and Israeli repression. So there's a way of kind of combining constellations of repression and repressive techniques, and kind of separating them from one another, either over time or across different units. Just my one finger was actually going to take us in a fairly different direction, but Sophia, I wanted to ask you how you feel about your results from an ethical perspective. That sounds like a super psychology question, but like, how does it make you feel? But really what I'm just getting at is, have you thought about the way that you're going to actually frame this paper in a way that makes you feel like you're meeting some ethical standard about what the long-term impacts of the findings might be? One observer might read your paper and come to a conclusion that home demolitions are really effective in demobilizing Palestinian resistance. So I'm just curious how you see that, whether you think that that's the finding you'd like to promote, whether it makes you uncomfortable, and if it does, how are you going to kind of navigate the ethical framing of the piece?
Am I on? Yeah. No, yeah, that's a really important and really hard question that, of course, I have thought about a lot. Like, oh, what if this just shows that demolitions are an effective means of coercion or something like that, and what would I do if that was the case? And I guess I don't know, except that I guess my first priority is to try to kind of let the data speak, and then think about how to frame this in a way that is fair, and that is going to cause the least amount of harm possible? I mean, this is a question that's relevant for like every paper that we write in conflict research, I think. And with observational studies, we don't have to go through any kind of ethical review. But for my other papers, I've gone through the ethical processes, and I just stick to the same kind of ethical guidance that I have for my survey work. I apply that to this paper as well. So what's the importance of the findings relative to the kind of harm it could cause, which I think any paper we write, there's a risk of it being misinterpreted. I don't know how to answer that question more except to say it's a hard question, and I'm going to be careful.
Actually, oh, please, go ahead, Erica.
I was just going to say, I have some ideas about how you can frame this. And, you know, one of the things I think that our field sometimes does that Christian and I have talked about a lot is there's always like a closing paragraph that says like policy implications. And usually those are very statist, right? They're the way that they're framed, the way they're oriented is for the government to learn something from my paper. And so just one really easy way to provide a fair kind of set of conclusions is to, instead of policy implications, say like practical implications or real world implications. And don't just talk about the implication for the Israeli government. Talk about the implications for people that are trying to promote human rights in the region, people that are maybe affected by home demolitions, what they would need to know from your findings. And, you know, review it from the perspective of the grassroots as well as, you know, more kind of elite formal institutions.
Amen to that. Thank you. It's Carly, snarky remark. You're up next, Carly.
Yeah. Christian always chill for the government. That's a fair. I guess I'll respond to that point and also my other original one finger. So I think you also need to be careful here about how you characterize Israel, because in your paper you're saying that you're claiming that Israel is not essentially using this as a tool to target people it doesn't like it's not trying to target Palestinians with militant attitudes. So it's not using it as a traditional tool of repression. In fact, Israel's using these home demolitions for some other reason, like basically they either want to establish facts on the ground, or it could be, which is not, you know, talked about in the paper, it could be that these are just illegal, and Israel views itself as carrying out the law, and that Israel also demolishes Jewish homes that are built illegally. That it might be a much less of a percentage. So like some data there would be helpful if you want to make the claim that this is in fact like a discriminatory, repressive thing that Israel is only doing to illegal Palestinian homes and not to illegal Jewish homes. Put some percentages up there, because in fact there are a lot of stories that make the news in Israel about like Jewish settlers being like pulled out of their homes, and it's really like even just the whole Gaza disengagement was this incredibly traumatic kind of action in Israeli society that still has created a lot of rifts. So that's something you'd want to consider if you are making the claim that this is essentially a tool of repression and not just Israel kind of maintaining order of law or something like that. I don't make that claim, but others might. And then just to turn back to something that everyone has mentioned about kind of the other tactics that states use to repress. So that's all going on in the background during this time period. And it's not necessarily problematic for you unless those other tactics are correlated in time and space with the demolition, in which case that's a huge omitted variable for you. That basically, it's not the home demolition orders that are causing these increases in protests, but it's, you know, bombings that are happening in the same space at the same time, and or something like that. So you'd have to present some evidence that those are uncorrelated. And I think some of your initial evidence actually suggests that they are correlated, like the peaks of Palestinian violence, the peak of Israeli engagement with Palestinian militants. And so you'd have to do a lot more work there to show that it's not these other activities that Israel is engaging in at the same time that's causing these changes in attitude.
Sophia.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And it's interesting what you're saying, and also what Christian is saying in terms of the other modes of repression and violence that are going on in the background. But one thing that I haven't really wrapped my mind around exactly how to talk about this or how important this is, but in a way, the demolition orders are kind of in the background of the demolitions, because there are so many more orders issued than demolitions are executed, and because those orders don't get reported in the media the same way that every single demolition is in international media. Like, I have a little Google alert set up, and I get something in my inbox every day. There's a demolition somewhere in Israel, somewhere in the West Bank. So, but orders are kind of in the background of that. And so I've been kind of thinking about that, but not really getting it. And I think that I need to do more work around, our orders in the background of demolitions, what's in the background of all of that. But those are really important issues.
Laura, is it too?
So, Sophia, I think that's a really important point, because, I mean, what your paper explicitly says is that once the orders are made, if they ever do lead to demolitions, it'll probably happen sometime in the next year or so. And so during the current year, when the survey is when people are responding to these surveys, the orders that were given the year before, some of them have manifested into demolitions. And again, to harp back on, maybe my house wasn't demolished, but a house that was given an order the same time I was given an order was demolished. And so I think that it's going to be really important for you to measure the demolitions in the current year of the survey, even though the temporal ordering may be messed up, because they're going to be related to those orders, and that's an omitted variable that I think would be driving part of your effect.
Sammy, I see a single finger, but I think you mean the two.
And the same, and the same idea of Laura. I think Sophia could estimate these on different period. That means you can add the number of house demolition at the current year. Then at the same time, lag one and lag, for example, number of house demolition 1 month before the public opinion polls conducted, and then 2 months before, and then 3 months, and we can also check when these effects vanished during the during the 1 year or 2 years. Yeah. Please have a look to my paper in Struggle Hearts for Palestinian Struggle Hearts and Minds, and you will find the correct estimation strategy, because we use there the number of fatalities, as the main control to examine the effect on the political preferences, and we used also public opinion polls data.
I'm loving the love fest that's taking place on the notes. Everyone very, very happy about this. I was just curious on this small two, Sophia. Methodologically, I'm just kind of
sorry.
So
if I don't have time, just because I want to add one thing about the mechanism. It's very important in your paper, and if you want really have a strong paper, you should also you should find the mechanism through the house demolition affect the political preferences. Otherwise, you will not be able to market your paper.
Well, there's plenty of papers without mechanisms, man. We could go to the review right now and see like the majority of the pieces in there. But
yeah, it's the band where she wants to publish.
Yeah. So I was going to ask Sophia, as you started the piece, I was actually thinking of some kind of selection model, right? Where you're just like, you have all geographic locations that could potentially have an order. Then you have the order, and then you have those that are followed through. I'm just kind of wondering how the setup you have is kind of like not addressing this kind of selection into these particular subsets, because clearly all locations haven't been subject to an order, right? So some locations as opposed to others, and then the compliance issue. And then on the compliance issue, I was kind of wondering about the kind of principal agent dynamics that were involved in like the allocations of, no worries, Sammy. The allocations of kind of like, you know, the demolition dynamic. I mean, you didn't actually discuss, I mean, like, is there, so from my kind of corrupt New York, Chicago background, I'm thinking like, okay, there's a group out there who just love demolition because they got their trucks and they got the cement businesses involved. And I'm just kind of like, you didn't discuss any of that, but it seems like in laying out the kind of apparatus that's involved in dealing with the Palestinian problem, right? It seems like, you know, there's an industry out there that's involved with demolition, and organizationally, are they wielding some kind of like influence to be like, yeah, okay, your security, whatever, but we're gonna roll because these people haven't been working enough this month and so forth. And so the minute you kind of took me in this other direction of thinking outside of the box of a strict kind of security concern as it takes on a kind of challenging organization, you got me thinking about kind of like, okay, well, what's the demolition industry? And like, you know, how much do these people need to work? What are they being paid? I'm like, what's the labor deal? Is there some kind of lobbying force that's compelling? Like, I was trying to understand why some locations were being demolished and others weren't. And you just kind of gave me one kind of security issue, and I was wondering about this organizational dynamic that's kind of like behind it. And similar to kind of like, I guess, the military-industrial complex in the United States, right? It's like, you know, president's measured it. I don't care who's in there. Let's keep rolling with our $100 billion budgets and just keep that going. And so then I started wondering about who was the organization behind the demolition, and what was their relationship to the mass public? What was their relationship to the security apparatus? What was their relationship to the political institutions? And so I was wondering if you had any response to that.
Yeah, I'm also, you know, from New York, so I thought about the whole, maybe there's the Caterpillar bulldozer industry. But in general, I don't know enough about this, but I would say that that determines how many orders get executed, when and where. There could be so many different things that drive that. I mean, it could also be kind of political, that maybe it looks good to have a crackdown every so often and execute a bunch of orders. Yeah, like you're saying, there could be budgetary concerns. But there could also be random stuff like terrain or elevation that prevents some orders from being executed. So I think it would be it would almost be harder to model what determines what orders get executed. There's so many different things. And then, you know, if there's an appeal, how long did it sit in court? Who is the judge? Was it a conservative judge? How was the judge feeling that day? I don't know. It's really interesting, but very complicated. To Sami's point about the different lag structures, I'm really unsure about how to deal with that, because it's unclear to me whether, since I don't have panel data, what I'm actually capturing when I look at this stuff over time. I don't know enough about this, but I mean, what I have is a lot of representative polls, but no, this is not a panel.
Yeah, okay.
So I'm not sure exactly how to interpret it. Even in the current setup, I'm very unsure how to handle the time dynamic. But that's just another reason to go find a different dependent variable. Because I think the time dynamic is really interesting, and I'd like to do a lot more with it.
Yeah.
There's also so much more I could do with the demolition order data in terms of status changes, the change in the status of the order. Orders get demolished, but then some orders also get put on hold. Some are in process for numbers of years, and I do have the date of the status change. So I only have the year of the demolition order, but I have the date, a lot of the dates anyway, for the status change. That feels like it would be a whole nother theoretical discussion about what does it mean you know, how that maybe you had more have to do with when are threats executed, or what is the impact of a threat being put on hold versus followed through, and that's a whole, it could be a whole nother paper, but it would be very interesting.
Laura had it too.
Yeah. So you're maybe so you're I'm looking at your equation, and the equation is set up like a panel because you have YIT, right? YIJT.
Exactly.
And so my understanding of the suggestion that came about the lag, it was the lag number of demolitions, right? So the actual number, you have the data, of the actual demolitions, right?
Right.
Because these are events.
Yeah.
So you can have the number of, and the surveys are restricted to years, right? And the actual orders are restricted to years.
The surveys are quarters, the orders are years.
Okay, the surveys are quarters. Awesome, that's even better. So, so you have these. So you have this quarter, and then you have the number of demolitions that you could have the number of demolitions that occurred during that quarter. Then, and you can even have the number of demolitions that occurred at the beginning of that quarter, since you have the date of the demolitions.
But the demolition data is on the year level, though.
The actual physical demolitions?
Oh, no, okay. I do have dates for, yeah, most of them.
Yeah, so you have the demolition events. So this is actually, this isn't getting at your causal relationship as it is getting at this underlying what's going on while they're answering these surveys. You know, are they reacting to an order that was given a year earlier, or are they reacting to buildings being torn down now? And so as a way of trying to isolate that, you have, you know, you could look at the number of demolitions during that quarter, or at least at the beginning of that quarter. And then you have, as another independent variable, the number of demolitions that happened the month prior to the quarter, or the 2 months prior to that quarter, trying to get at a cumulative effect of the building of the stress. And so those who were given, you know, when there are a lot of demolition orders the year before, and they see these demolitions happening, that's a whole nother context. And I think those are important things to at least add as control variables. And that's not limited by the structure of your data set. So
Thoughts, Sophia?
You
don't have to.
Yeah, no, that's true, and that's important, and I should do that.
Great.
And I can, which is cool. So I'll do that.
I want to do the strange thing for me, which is actually act like a traditional political scientist. But so I'd actually suggest there's 3 different factors that we kind of identified in the conversation that are influencing the kind of compliance with the order. There's your security concern, and that's like threat from the local population. Maybe some sense of Israeli vengeance, like somebody got killed and they're ready to kind of ramp it up. There's some kind of organizational dynamic. There's kind of troop allocations nearby and so forth. Or there's under the security concerns, it could also be the settler. There's also a politician kind of dynamic, right? So I'm just wondering if someone has got geographic kind of like responsibility for a particular area, and they're supposed to basically produce something in that particular locale, and they're responding to some constituency that has more progressive or more conservative kind of driving interests. I'm just like, there's a kind of democracy accountability dimension, right? So we mentioned the international component, but there's also a domestic component. So the Israeli population wants something, and that varies a little bit. And I'm wondering if that electoral component has any effect whatsoever on what these, I mean, is the demolition company, is it governmental or not? It's not, right? Or do they roll with the government? When they roll out the trucks, are they coming with the cops and the military?
Yeah.
So they're escorted by the government. I mean, so even getting to that would help us understand the politicized nature of these events, right? Because you say demolition to me, I'm just like, is it state demolition or is it a private company? Okay, you kind of have this hybrid. And so it would be useful to kind of get that kind of sense of what's in there. Because as I was trying to think of the compliance thing, sorry to still kind of harp on that one, but I'm still kind of like, I'm like, okay, they're issuing orders left and right, but they're not following through. I mean, do they need to follow through? Is the threat sufficient? I mean, I love, and at the same time, I'm like, oh, not again. You expand the idea because like, I love the fact that you go back to this kind of difference between coercion and force. And at the same time, I'm like, there's still all this other stuff going on. So I'm like, so that I found to be compelling. But one of the reasons why threats are sufficient is either there's a bunch of abuse going on elsewhere, or the population is kind of like rife to be influenced. But the exact actors that were involved with making this decision, because if politics matter, or if the economic dynamics of the kind of companies and so forth matter, I was missing that element. And so maybe kind of fleshing that out a bit would help for figuring out which way the paper is going to go and which kind of theoretical arguments are useful. Because you have the perpetration, you have the perpetrators, and I'm kind of like, well, what's the driving theoretical kind of component? And your setup is kind of like unified actor rationalist in a sense, but you're disaggregating actors already, you're disaggregating kind of targeting strategies, and so that didn't quite kind of like flesh out for me. And I think we're open as to Q. Oh no, Carly, you had a 2? Your volume is really low. Oh, you might need to scream, but I don't want you to scare your baby.
Okay, so basically what I was saying is that...
Lean in.
I can't lean in. I have new head. You can keep going while I try to...
It's not just me, right? There's like some sound issue. No. Wow, what happened?
Forget it.
Okay, I heard that. I heard the forget it. So maybe try.
Okay, basically the choice to focus on the threat DV in some ways strengthens your argument because it's actually a very weak instance of repression because they haven't even repressed yet and they're still getting an effect. On the other hand, it also begs the question of if it's that's triggering the change in attitudes, or like Laura and a couple other people mentioned, if it's the cumulative effect of the threat plus the demolitions that's causing this change.
The sound came in at the end. Go figure. Sophia.
Yeah, I think that clear that I need to somehow talk more about the threat versus actual execution of the order, or the cumulative impact of both. Or that needs to be, I think, a bigger part of the paper. And maybe if it is a bigger part of the paper, maybe that would make it, maybe that would address a little bit of the issue that Christian is raising, that it's hard to see what's the single takeaway, that there's so many different directions that this is going. So maybe focusing on kind of threat versus order and really working that into the empirics more might be a good idea. But another thing that I'm also noticing is that actually in this, the paper is being pulled in a couple different directions too, because as I'm kind of trying to back up this endogeneity claim, bringing up, causing a lot of focus on what are the motivations, what are Israel's motivations. The main focus of the paper, although it's interesting, and it could also be, that could be a different paper to really try to just look into what are the causes of demolition orders, and then that can tie more to the literature on tactic selection and also on the literature on why do states issue threats and under what circumstances they follow through and so on. But I think that I need to try to find a balance between making the endogeneity claim, if that's valid, but also setting that aside relatively quickly so that it doesn't draw too much attention away from looking at the effects of demolition orders.
I like the idea of kind of drilling down in this respect. I'm not familiar with the tactical regime stuff that that Erica was referencing earlier and Laura, but I definitely would like to kind of like explore that. But I was thinking of Jim Ron's thing, right? So he's got a piece, I'll say 10, 12 years ago, I'm not sure. But it's on switches in tactical repertoires for the Israelis and what's driving that switch. The interesting thing I'm finding about your piece is like, it is a non-traditional form of something that could be repressive. And so, and whether or not it's overt, very clear repression, or it's development, I think that juxtaposition would be useful, right? Because you could just say, okay, there's a development plan, and in this context, the development plan has some political implications. But are all the locations equally politicized? And so this is a contextualization of your demolition, right? So let's say that there was no resistance in an area and Palestinians are very pro-Israeli in a particular location and there's no organization, but there's still a demolition. Well, why is there demolition? Well, because maybe some houses were ready. I mean, right? So not all of the demolition could be equally politicized. And so to differentiate that, I think would be very useful for be like, okay, so because you'd expect these developmentally ones or humanitarian ones, right? Because it's so horrible. That might be driven by certain forces, but the politicized demolitions would be driven by other forces. So this, I think, is very interesting. And I mean, if you reflect on Sammy's enthusiasm when he began, no one refers to someone else's piece as brilliant. We just don't roll that way. We're very selfish. He was identifying the fact that there's a huge opening and no rigorous work on a particular topic, and that to kind of probe that, to get at those different explanations would be very useful. And my thing is, and I don't think this is just a kind of Israel-Palestine type thing. I mean, I think of, there's developmental issues with regards to, first, a bunch of black people were put into kind of ghettos and so forth and high rises in the US. And then these were demolished when these populations became somewhat aggressive and contentious in the 60s. So I think there's precedent to think about these things. This argument could potentially travel, but the idea of the politics of demolition, there's a much better title out there, I'm sure. There's, you know, to explore that, I think is extremely kind of like lucrative and interesting. But then I like the fact that you have the threats to do it and places where it's actually done. And I'm like, so it always goes through that sequence, right? It's not done some places and there was no order issued, right? So there's always this sequence. Yes, okay. Yeah,
sorry.
so I mean,
yeah, and that addresses Laura's question too. So with administrative demolitions, there should always be an order first before the demolition is executed. Then I couldn't tell you if there are also perhaps demolitions being executed without the order being in place, because I don't know, but it could be possible. In that case, there's no way to observe that. With the punitive demolitions, this was Laura's question. I think that they still issue an order, but Palestinians can't appeal that order in the punitive demolitions. And there's another kind of threat stage in the punitive demolitions, because they'll send soldiers to the house and they'll take measurements and they'll kind of prepare the ground for demolition. And so that can happen way in advance of the actual demolition. So there's the same kind of, the soldiers come, they take measurements, they prepare for the demolition, and then even a year could go by without that punitive demolition being executed. So there's differences, but there's also some similarities in the sense that there's some kind of threat, although the order itself is not a threat in the sense that it can't be appealed in court. So
the minute, I have a quick two and then to Sammy. The minute you say that they take measurements, I think of two things. One, William Seltzer's work. William Seltzer talks about the idea of population management and how censi normally precede some form of repression. And so I just remembered that prior to Israel kind of stepping into Palestine in many respects, there was also an effort to go out and kind of like measure block by block who would be deemed threatening and then what should happen subsequently. And so this allows you to get to another dimension of kind of like, because that's a threat actually, before the order is issued, if people are out measuring things, and that's kind of like fascinating. We are scheduled to wrap up quick. So Sammy, if you can make your comment quickly so we could let Sophia take us out.
It's okay, no problem. I would talk to Sophia later about how to really, maybe she need to design again his paper and his research. I give an example, and this is, you know, I'm continue with your question about why it's important, the house demolition, and how we can really use the house demolition and compare it with other maybe community. I give you an example. There is also 20% of the Israeli population are Palestinian, and I'm one of them. And there is also house demolition inside the Israeli community across these localities. And there is a huge, you know, variance between localities in among the Arab community. So you can, and this is maybe another paper, and we can write together. So this is will be very nice if you want to take it, just compare between the Arab-Palestinian, Israeli Arab-Palestinian citizen of Israel and Palestinian in West Bank and Gaza, and just to check how the house demolition affect the political preferences. Yeah, and this will be kind of, you know, diff and diff between two groups.
I was just joking on the side that Sammy offers some reading, some data, co-authorship. Next, going to come some grants. You know, this guy doesn't play. He's the guest that never.
No, I'm joking, but this is really. But the problem with this idea, it will be that to find, you know, political opinion survey among the Arab community inside Israel.
Sophia, we like to normally kind of like allow the presenter / author an opportunity to kind of like query the group for a quick kind of comment or something related to that, but anything?
I don't know. There's a lot of suggestions on the table, which is, it's really, really great for me because I've been struggling with this a lot. So this has been incredibly helpful. And I think that the easiest for me would just be if I can follow up with you each individually.
That is perfect. Okay, and in terms of timing, you cannot get any better than that. We will stop the broadcast at that point. Thank you all very much. Eric and I enjoy doing this stuff. It's definitely useful. Sophia's response couldn't have been better scripted in terms of trying to figure out why it is we're doing this stuff. And everybody, thank you for coming, and see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Peace.